Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about quality assurance and pay. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, should there be a difference in pay between a QA and a developer? And the short answer is yes, sometimes at least. Let me explain. So quality assurance, or QAs, for those of you who may be developers and don't know this, is pretty much just a person, it's a person who is responsible for maintaining the project quality. Now that is a very loose term, I know it. Some people think of a QA as a tester, someone who does testing, and the people who are actually QAs will know that a real QA usually is involved in a much broader sense than just testing at the end of the feature release. A real QA, the sort of person who actually does the thing that they are educated to do, is an individual who is actually involved from the early stages of the project all the way down to feature delivery. Because you have different sets of requirements and different testing types that needs to take place at all steps of the process, at the planning stage, at the user testing phase, so like the validation, when we're actually developing the concept, and then you have things such as like the delivery, or the development of the software, and then the delivery. And then you of course have maintenance and bugs and prioritizations and so forth. I've worked with some truly talented QAs, and one in particular, she was top-notch, really top-notch QA. And that is a full-time job. I saw her work at least as hard as all of the developers. That sort of individual is, in my opinion, the person who is actually empowered to be able to be involved in that in such an extent, and actually has the influence to set up a good work culture around testing quality and quality of the software delivery. That's an individual that is on par, I would say, in value with most developers. Now, the sad fact, on the other hand, is that sort of role, or the thing that I just described, having someone who's actually involved in that regard, to that extent, it's rare. I'm not saying rare maybe, but it's more common that a QA thinks that that's what you're going to do. But because of the company work culture, you're actually nothing more than a tester, or a person who just does the testing, because that, depending on the company work culture, is what you're going to get hired to do. And that basically means that all you do, if you can call it that, is to test the software that the developers have produced. And that is such a dangerous position. Like some companies, my company today as an example, we don't hire testers for this exact purpose, because if you hire a tester and not like a real quality assurance type of person, odds are that you will actually see a dip in quality, because what the developers will do, most of them at least, is that they will get comfortable with the fact that they have someone after they have written the software who's going to do all the validation. They're going to get lazy because they don't do the testing, which means that odds are that they will just ship it and kind of just shove it down the line. And the tester is the final person before you actually hand over to DevOps, depending on if you do DevOps or if you have an infra team or something like that, when you actually do the deployment. Which means that the tester is in this kind of shitty position, and I've seen such horrible things for testers in general, because you're at the very last stage of the delivery cycle, which means that all the planning, like the time budget that you have, is always against you. Because if the development takes longer than expected, which it usually does, or the design takes longer, or changes are made, or things that scope creep, and like all of these good things that happen very organically within any delivery cycle, all of that takes away time from the testing, which means that as a normal tester, all you basically do is that you try to speedily go through the feature, trying to click through and trying to like use the system in some way that figures out if there's some type of issue, right? And usually under time pressure, and usually you have this enormous pressure from everybody else saying that, oh, it's good enough, it's good enough, it's good enough, because we just need to ship it. You're basically you become this weird formality step that just has to happen. And usually, as I said, it actually leads to worse software, because the developers get comfortable with that they don't have to test their own code, or at least they don't have to test it all that much. which actually is a worse thing. Then you might as well, because if that's all you're doing as a QA, then they may as well just hire a developer and have the developers test their own code. Because the developers, they can they can just click through things as well. Like they can do that as well. And that's just a fraction of the sort of work that a real QA should be doing, if you ask me. So in that, if that is the situation, then yeah, then you should, there is no then a QA is not as valuable. If you're treating them in that fashion in a company, then sure, they shouldn't be paid as much as a developer, because they don't produce as much value as a developer will. Some companies do this and they don't pay QAs as well, but the companies who actually empower a QA to do serious work, and they hire real QAs and not just testers, they will pay them basically the same amount as a developer, depending on skill range and so forth, of course. The times that I feel that you should pay there is actually one scenario where I feel like a QA should actually be paid more than a developer. And that is if you're working for a very big company and the QA in question either, of course, is extremely skilled, but if you have a QA that can actually not only deal with work processes and actually do the testing and so forth, but also ideally if they can code, or if they have resources to actually produce automated testing or automated solutions to testing, that is an enormously valuable asset to have. Because you will always need developers, but the problem is that the more developers you have, and depending on work cultures and so forth, you will get you will get an enormous return on investment if you have some individual who actually can take charge and really own the automating and the testing process, or the automation of testing within the company. Because if you can even automate just a few steps in a really big system, that's going to equivalent to several testers. Because doing manual testing exclusively for a really large system is enormously costly. It's almost unfeasible for the really big systems. You need some way to automate that, because it's so much work. And if you have a QA that can take charge of that and do that on themselves, they're going to outweigh their own salary in a heartbeat if they do this sort of thing. But that does require them to actually have the sort of empowerment and the knowledge to actually do this. But such an individual in the right company is definitely worth a salary much higher than that of the normal programmer, or the average programmer, because the value to the company to solve this problem is it's so high. It's so damn high. It is the difference of delivering in months and delivering in weeks, or in weeks in 2 days. It makes such a big difference. Lastly, I will say that this only really, in my world, applies if you're working at the larger scales. At smaller companies, if we're talking really small startups where it's just a few people and so forth, usually it's not really a QA is a luxury, usually, I would say. If you have a QA, it will be an investment that you make because you either believe that your product actually needs a quality assurance type of person in the early stages, and then usually such an individual will earn or should be paid roughly as much as the developers ideally. But it's rare that I see QAs get paid a decent salary, or that they're even in the really small startups, or the really small companies, because companies that at that size, they usually don't have enough complexity in their systems and enough problems with quality to warrant that extra paycheck. They will rather pay that to another developer to increase development speed, because speed is much more important when you have a really small system that doesn't have all that much complexity. But for large systems, the QA is invaluable. So what I want you to take away from this is that I believe that there should usually be a difference between the salary or the value, at least, of a QA and a developer. They are fairly equal in value to a company if the system is really large, at a really large company, and most of what both parties do is to just assure the quality of the software. Because if you have, let's say you have several mobile apps, a web presence, and you have all these, maybe you have a desktop thing, there's so much manual testing that needs to take place in order for you to actually deliver confidently. So if you hire a few QAs that does a lot of that work, that's definitely worth the same sort of amount as the developers, because then the time that the developer would have to spend validating all of these different platforms and the different devices and so forth will take a really long time to do, and that's where a QA comes in. You will never have as many QAs as you have developers, but the QAs that you do have, they are worth that paycheck for sure. They're worth even more than a developer if they can take charge of the automating of the process. In other words, that they are the sort of people who can actually make testing go even faster and create work processes that actually benefit the company in such a way that you can deliver with more confidence. Then they're worth more. They're not worth especially much if all they do is manual testing. If that's the only thing, like at the end stage, they kind of just do it. Unless I said, if you have a really big company and you need to do that much testing, then yeah, sure, then they're kind of equal. And lastly, I would say that they're almost not worth any paycheck to a really small company. The smallest companies, they should ideally just invest in speed as much as possible, because usually quality becomes a real issue, either at a very specific type of product or at larger scale. Small scale companies usually don't have to care so much about quality, and they can usually focus more on speed. Have a great day.